Greetings and salutations. My name is Ivan Francis Wilbanks, and I am your host for Threads and Chats, a channel where we talk about fashion and the cultural influence, as well as the history behind some of our favorite fashion trends, and exactly where did they come from. So, today we're going to be talking about fashion and the law, because fashion and the law intersect quite a bit, and from a day-to-day experience as a legal practitioner here in the state of Georgia in the United States, I have my own personal experiences with fashion and also having to advise clients on how to dress for when they go to court. Now, granted, some of the information that I will provide to you today on this video is going to be a little bit interesting and also maybe shocking, but remember that this will be coming from my own experience as a legal professional in the state of Georgia, but also as a person who has been deeply involved with learning fashion and fashion concepts over the last decade. And so, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about when we're talking about fashion with regard to the court or with regard to the legal system is that usually the trend with fashion when it comes to the legal system and the court is that it is more conservative than your normal street fashion most of the time. Now, the reason why I say most of the time is because there are some outliers, and also with respect to our celebrities and our public figures, they're able to have a little bit more leeway when it comes to how they present in a courtroom, mainly because of their branding and their imaging, and also because of the fact that they do have stylists that do work with them, and also the stylist happens to sometimes consult with their legal team, because remember, it is not just about necessarily the law, but also about the public perception with that celebrity going in and out of a courtroom or that public figure going in and out of a courtroom. From my own experience, I will always tell people that when you're going to court, the rule of thumb is to always wear something that doesn't draw additional attention to you than what's already happening, because we're in court. We're at the moment in which a judge is looking down at you, probably condescendingly from the bench, or the jury is examining every single move, every single word that you're making inside of the courtroom. And so you have to be very careful of what you're putting on. So if you're going for a divorce trial, I always tell people, don't wear a red dress for a divorce trial. It's not necessarily the time to party. When you come to court for a divorce, whether it be that you are a client that identifies as a man or a client that identifies as a woman or anybody for that matter, you want to make sure that you're appearing before the court as respectfully as possible, and also, again, in a way where it doesn't draw too much attention. So people always ask me, well, what do I wear to court? So the reality of it is that when it comes to fashion and when you go to court, there are a few things you need to consider. The first things first is season appropriateness, because people sometimes don't think about what they're wearing to court. They want to make sure that they're dressed, appropriately, but they have to also keep in mind that the season is important. We live here in the South, or I live here in the South. I live in Georgia in the United States, and it is August, which means it is one of the hottest months of the year. It is a normal day for it to be over 90 degrees here in the state of Georgia during the month of August. So with that being said, you're going to see the average person coming to court, namely in either linen clothing, so either you have your linen shirts, your seersucker, you have women that may wear sundresses or lighter versions of cotton and linen also to court. And even with respect to suiting, you see that suiting usually may take on either a lighter color, which means that either people are going to be wearing lighter gray versions of suits or lighter blue versions of suits. Or you may also see that if you're looking at our female counterparts or women counterparts who are going to court, they're also wearing, again, very light fabrics and very lightly colored fabric, because they want to deflect some of that heat away from themselves when they're either going away from court or coming to court or going around the metropolitan area of Atlanta or what have you. Be that as it may, the importance for a person coming to court as a regular person is that you don't want to have on a puffer jacket in the summer, mainly for two reasons. Number one is I don't think it's going to be comfortable for you. But number two, depending upon how you're dressed for court, it could be seen as a security issue, and some people don't talk about that. So when you're going to court, you don't want to raise any suspicions or any eyebrows. Make sure you're dressed appropriately for the season. Now, for number two, it is making sure that you are appropriately attired in the right type of garments. And what does that mean? So I remember I had a case a few years ago where I was representing a client in a family law matter, and it was a custody case where there was at least 2 or 3 young children involved. And the big issue that popped up in the case was mom showing up to court in a miniskirt and a halter top. Now, for most people, that should not draw any sort of conclusion as to a person's ability to parent. And I know for me, my argument was that it doesn't impact my client's ability to parent. However, at the end of the day, it still comes down to the idea of respect for the law, respect for institutions, and also respect to the judicial system specifically. I actually had to advise my client before we walked in the courtroom to turn around, go home, get changed, and come back. And thank goodness we did, because we were able to get the client to come back with a plain shirt, plain blazer, plain pair of pants. And when she presented in court, she did an amazing job. Now, my client asked me, well, why did you make me go back home and get changed? Again, it should not matter. However, the one thing that I always have to remind people is that when you're going to court, whether it be that you're before a jury or you're before a judge making the final decision on your case, the reality of it is that people's biases and perceptions are going to color the decisions that they make. And even though they shouldn't, it does. The old saying is that justice is blind. And sometimes it can be, but most times it is not. Because remember, people look at fashion as another form of communication and expression, whether it be that it's a person communicating and expressing their feelings, whether it be a person communicating and expressing their identity, whether it be a person communicating and expressing a concept. The reality of it is that any type of fashion, if I'm wearing a basic suit all the way up to something avant-garde and very a la Rick Owens and Balenciaga, the reality of it is that I'm still expressing something. And so when you're going to court, I had to explain to my client that you're expressing something to the court when you are coming to court dressed a certain way. And while I don't agree with it, nor do I subscribe to it, the reality of it is that we're dealing with a judge who is making a decision, right, in a custody case. Or if we're going even as far as talking about personal injury cases, the way how a person presents in a courtroom in a personal injury case before a jury, again, can have a very substantial impact. Because, say for instance, I have a client walking into a courtroom before a jury, and they're dripped out in Balenciaga and dripped out in Louis Vuitton and all these luxury brands, but they're saying that they're owed $1 million for a car accident case. Well, the issue becomes for the jury, does this person really need the money, right? That is the thought process in these jurors' minds. And while that is not the proper thought that they should be having, it should be on the perspective of legally, was this person injured and were they entitled to recovery? Again, the ideology still falls from, okay, this person walked into court demonstrating their wealth and demonstrating how much money they have. So do they really need $1 million, especially if they said they only had about $40,000 in medical damages? Again, when you listen to arguments and you see how a person's presenting in court, a decider of fact can very quickly determine whether or not their claim is legitimate or not. And so I always tell people that it's not just the words and the testimony, but it's also exactly how you show up that day in court that makes the big difference. Which is part of the reason why when we talk about our celebrities actually have teams of people who they consult with prior to going to court. So now this actually helps us segue into part 2 of our discussion, where we analyze celebrity fashion in the courtroom and talk about exactly why these decisions were good decisions to begin with. So the second part of the video, we're going to be focusing on the celebrities and how they show up to court, to use some examples in real life about how presentation in court actually impacts everyone, including public figures. So when we're talking about some of our celebrities, I want to use a couple of examples from the last few years and even going further back in time to highlight exactly what I'm talking about. So the first celebrity I wanted to highlight in this video is Meg Thee Stallion. So during the odyssey of Meg Thee Stallion and the Tory Lanez matter, which there's still some back and forth going on with that now, the reality of it was that Meg Thee Stallion had to come to court presenting in a way that was different than her normal persona, but still was true to her. So a lot of people know Meg Thee Stallion. She's outspoken, she's brazen, she will show herself and show her body. And again, all the power to her, because she has the right to do that, right? And she looks amazing when she does it. Now, when she comes to court, though, she has to be mindful that, again, she's now presenting herself as necessarily a person who has been subject to a crime. So as a victim of a crime, she now needs to present herself in the courtroom. And so when she shows up in court, remember, she's a public figure, she's a celebrity, but she also has to, again, remember that she is a victim of a crime. And so when she comes to court, she comes into court with this purple suit on and this bob. Now, mind you, in my mind, this was absolutely great. I love this look. LaRoche did his big one when he styled this look. And considering the fact that this suit cost $10,000 off of the runway, it was styled perfectly for Meg and it looked amazing on her. But let's talk about it from the standpoint of not just the fashion from the visual perspective, but also the significance of it and symbolism of it. So Meg the Stallion comes into court with this purple suit on. And so with this purple suit, the tailoring is very, very nice. It's very intentionally put on her body. Even the choice of hairstyle is very intentional, right? We look at the bob as the more conservative hairstyle choice in the modern fashion world because we look at the bob as a more mature hairstyle, and so she's coming in with this mature bob hairstyle. She's coming in with this very strongly tailored suit, but the color is very, very bold and it stands out. Right. And so this is something that if I had a celebrity client, I would advise my celebrity client to show up in something exactly like this. Because again, she's here for a business. While she is Meg the Stallion, right? Meg the Stallion, in this particular instance, is also now a victim who is presenting herself before the court to provide her testimony. Right. And I think that that is something that's important because even though she is a public figure, the entirety of the trial or the entirety of the focus is not going to be on her. It should really be on the exact legal result that makes the most sense in light of the crime that has taken place. And so the reality of it is that you have Meg the Stallion dressed up in the suit. She's put together very well. She's covered up. And she's presenting herself before the court in a respectable manner in which they can look beyond necessarily the fact that she's a public figure and see that, yeah, a crime did take place here. And while, again, it should not be the case that a person's dress determines whether or not someone gets justice or whether or not a legal result should happen, again, when you're dressing a certain way, even though it is true to your style and sense of fashion, you still have to be mindful that, again, you're in a business setting and the courtroom is a business setting, no doubt about that. Right? So then we move on to my second example. And we're going to take this back about 20 years, where we're now highlighting Little Kim when she was in court in 2005. And we're looking at her looks in 2005. We're taking a look at all of the things that she was wearing back then. And again, the same rule is true throughout looking at her fashion choices when Little Kim was appearing in court in 2005. And Marc Jacobs basically outfitted her in some of the best suiting that you probably could get for the time. So Marc Jacobs made sure that she was put in very conservative cuts of suiting. Her colors were not too loud and not too brazen. They were soft colors. And even with regard to the choice of makeup and hairstyling, right? Again, we know Little Kim is very colorful. She's going to put on a wig that's green or a pink or a blue, right? She's going to have that makeup. She's going to have that shimmer. She's going to have that eyeshadow. She's going to have a bold lip every now and then. But when she went to court, Little Kim wasn't giving that. She was giving, again, business, professional. She was giving, I am a celebrity and I have money, but I'm not going to necessarily put myself out as overly gaudy. And even for 2005, this looked pretty good as far as not necessarily being overly embellished, right? So when Little Kim came before the court, she looked the way that we would expect a person to look when they're facing a jury, right? And I think that this was a very good styling choice for her considering the time frame, because again, it was 20 years ago. But the rule still applies 20 years later, and it will be probably the rule time immemorial that when you're going to court, you want to make sure that you are still presented in a way where you look like a business professional or you have some professionalism in the clothing choice. And whoever styled her was able to keep that in mind as well. Again, ensuring that, yes, she is a celebrity and a public figure, and we're going to stay true to her brand. However, we need to make sure that when she goes to court, her legal team has less of a hard job of trying to humanize her and paint her as the right type of person to be before a jury or a judge, right? And I think that that's very important and very strategic, because a lot of times we don't think about the strategic reason why we put on certain pairs of clothes or sets of clothing, or why we pick out certain sorts of outfits. So again, another great example as to why clothing choice is something that you should very closely examine before you go to court. And then we don't want to leave out our fellas in the type of discussion. So we're now going to then move over to A$AP Rocky. And so when we're looking at, again, A$AP Rocky's choices, we're looking at his choice of clothing. And it's very conservative. You have a lot of YSL suiting and a lot of YSL pieces. You know, the Saint Laurent pieces that he is wearing are very nicely done. They're very conservative in color. They're dark. The tailoring is very, very good. And again, we're used to seeing A$AP Rocky in a more less refined sort of aesthetic, but still has a little bit of that refinement in it. But when you're looking at how he showed up for court, there's still that little bit of ruggedness, but the ruggedness is toned down. And then you are able to see this, this high tailoring, this very good sort of refinement and a maturity that shows through in this new sort of courtroom fashion that he's providing. So you're getting the suiting, you're getting the trench coats, you're getting the loafers, you're getting those sorts of elements that are commonplace in men's fashion when they go to court. But they're done in such a way where it's true to A$AP Rocky once again, because A$AP Rocky's A$AP Rocky. He's a public figure, and at the end of the day, he still wants to make sure that he looks like himself, despite the fact that he's going to court and presenting himself before a judge and or a jury. And so with that being the case, we now move to the final part of our video examining fashion and the law in the courtroom. So for the last part of the video, I'm going to touch on judicial bias and with respect to fashion, how fashion, again, dictates these sort of things, even though they should not. So one of the things that people often are not aware of is that in the event of a criminal case, defendants actually sometimes are given an option of what clothing they can wear, because it's considered to be, quote, prejudicial for a criminal defendant to come to court with their jail jumpsuit on, right? So when you have a defendant who's incarcerated and they're wearing the state-issued prison suit or the state-issued overalls or what have you, what happens is that you sometimes have judges in certain jurisdictions that allow a defendant to choose a certain choice of outfit, whether it be that the person is wearing, a button-up shirt and a sweater over it, or a button-up shirt and a blazer over it and a simple pair of slacks, such as khakis. But these decisions are made on purpose, right? Because one of the things that we talk about is the concept of prejudice, especially against criminal defendants. The concept of prejudice basically means that we don't want to put anything on a criminal defendant that could make them look even more guilty than what they probably are, notwithstanding the facts and circumstances of the case. And so what is the attempt by certain jurists or certain courts is that they actually provide the defendant with clothing options prior to coming to court in a criminal case to try to lessen the sting of them appearing in a jail jumpsuit. Now, does it work? It sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't. But it goes without saying that even jurists or judges are aware that there is a bias that could be implied by certain sorts of fashion choices or certain outfits that are worn by defendants in a courtroom, or by any party in a courtroom for that matter. And so when we're talking about it from the standpoint of how a person should be dressed, you have a lot of lawyers that they'll actually take a lot of time to go through their defendant's or their client's closet and say, don't wear this to court. Don't pick that out. Especially when we're talking about, some of our defendants or clients that have more monetary access, right? Believe it or not, people don't think about how much energy is placed into advising your clients of how to show up to court, right? I can talk from my own experience. I've had to advise dozens of clients on how to appear for court. Even, you'll be surprised. You'll have to advise clients that are professionals, that are bankers or doctors, right, of how to show up to court, because they're not always aware of exactly how to show up for court. Or another big example is, I've had to represent mothers in cases where it involves child support. And some of those parents who have child support cases, they're not necessarily always poor mothers that are single, right? Sometimes what happens is that you do have a divorce case in which a wealthier couple gets divorced, and alimony and child support are a part of the case because they're minor children. And so what happens is that when you go to court and you're representing the mother of children, and you're representing the ex-wife, the big thing that you may run into is, especially when you're dealing with your high asset clients, is you have to tell them, hey, maybe you shouldn't wear your Louis Vuitton bag to court that day. Maybe you shouldn't be wearing, your Balenciaga sunglasses to court. Because the thought process is that if you're going to court asking the court to provide you financial relief, how in good conscience could they provide that financial relief if you're wearing a bag that costs thousands of dollars, right? And the argument could be made, well, they bought the bag during the marriage, it shouldn't matter. But again, it's about optics, right? If any person were in the courtroom, and mind you, in America, most court proceedings are public. We actually have the right to view our proceedings according to our Constitution. it will leave the taste of a lot of people's mouths if they had people come into court asking for $2,000, $3,000 worth of money in child support every month, but at the end of the day, they're also walking around with Birkin bags. A lot of people would feel a little bit, I would say, upset by that, or I guess with a sense of unreadiness about that. And while child support is based on the numerical calculations of income, it's not based on what people actually have. Believe it or not, the law in Georgia specifically that I'm aware of, when I did family law, is that the court can actually look at a lot of different factors to determine a person's financial access or their person's financial, ability, right? And so when you have luxury items or when you have things that are expensive that you're wearing to court, what happens is that the court can sometimes take those things into consideration, especially if that comes up on cross-examination. And I've even had it where judges will also make comments, well, that's a nice bag, right? And the thing is that, again, you need to be mindful of that, especially if you're representing your clients, because it could come back to bite you in the behind. It's not a fun thing. I've had it happen. It's not fun. But again, it's not really what the court should be focusing on. And I think that is really a bigger demonstration of how, again, fashion is not just necessarily, something that's just existing in the background. It is another form of communication that we have to be mindful of, right? I went to college for communications at Howard. One thing I learned in my communications courses is that 70% of communication is nonverbal. So the 30% that I'm giving you is the 30% that I'm giving you. But 70% of it are the things that are not spoken, whether it be the tone of my voice, the choice of fashion that I'm wearing, my hand gestures, how I move my head. Those are just as important as the words being spoken. So you could have a perfect case on paper, but because of how a party has shown up in court, it can tank your whole case. And so with that being said, I want this to basically just be a clear demonstration that fashion is not just a pretty game, but it actually does have real life impacts for people that go before the court or even do any sort of work out there in the world. And so without saying much else, it has been a pleasure to have you in this episode of Threads and Chats, and I hope to see you in the next one. So long.